Welcome, everybody. My name is Tony Morgan, and I'm the founder and lead strategist for the Unstuck Group. And we are just grateful to have you today for today's webinar on leading change. Back at the beginning of the year, we invited pastors, church leaders to join us with the Unstuck Church Challenge, Change Challenge at the beginning of the year. We had 600 leaders participate with us through a 15-day journey to kick off the start of a new ministry year. And we invited all those leaders to help us identify what were the key changes that you were hoping to make in 2017. And as a result of that, we identified these top 3 changes: building momentum around a new vision, reorganizing your leadership structure, and simplifying your discipleship path. And with that, that's the focus of today's webinar. We're going to hit all 3 of those topics. And to do that, I've invited some friends to join me. Let me introduce you to the folks that will be a part of today's conversation. First of all, let me introduce Carey Nieuwhof. Carey is the founding pastor of Connexus Church. You may also know him from his popular blog and podcast. Carey, welcome to today's conversation.
It's great to be with you again, Tony, and great to be with everyone.
And then also we have with us Paul Alexander. Paul is the executive pastor of Sun Valley Community Church. That's located out in the Phoenix area. They have 5 campuses. Paul is also a longtime ministry consultant with the Unstuck Group. Paul, welcome back.
Really glad to be with you today, Tony. Thank you.
And let me also introduce to you one of the newest ministry consultants for the Unstuck Group. This is Gabe Kolstad. Gabe is also the lead pastor of Westside Community Church out in the Portland, Oregon area. He's our first consultant from the Northwest. Gabe, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with everybody.
And then also working in the background, we have live Q&A chat throughout our conversation today. Mark Meyer from our team will be helping to respond to questions on the fly in the chat room. And then toward the end of our discussion today, we'll also take some of the questions that you're submitting. If we don't hit them in the chat room or on today's webinar, we'll try to include those questions in future content on the blog so you can watch for those. And if you want to get your friends to join the conversation today, you can also share on Twitter and Facebook. Just use #Unstuck. So let's dive into the conversation. And we're going to begin with that first big change that the leaders, part of the Unstuck Change Challenge, were wanting to ask us about, and that's building momentum around a new vision. And Carey, for this first section, I want to chat with you. I know when you began Connexus Church, you began by casting a new vision, getting people on board. Would you mind sharing a bit of that story?
Yeah, sure. So we launched Connexus Church just over 9 years ago. And it was a really exciting time for us. I'd been in the area. I've been in this area for about 22 years. And so I'd led for 12 years within a mainline denomination, and we had seen 3 small churches grow dramatically, reaching people. We amalgamated them, built a new church with a new name on a new site, and did that for 7 years. But then as we were growing, started to think to the future, multi-site, expanded reach, and a few other issues, and thought, what would it be like to start again in a non-denominational context? And that's where the idea for Connexus was born. So it was at the very end of 2007 that we decided to withdraw from, our current association, and that meant leaving everything behind and starting over again. And this time as the first Canadian North Point strategic partner. I had met Reggie Joyner and Andy Stanley a year or 2 prior to that, and they were launching partnerships. And so we didn't want to be alone, but it gave us a tremendous opportunity, I think, as leaders, to cast a very clear vision. I'd always had a heart for the unchurched. That was something that God had given me from the very beginning. But I know as most people would relate to, sometimes it's hard to get exact language and definition around that. And when we signed on as a North Point church, it just allowed us, we'd been clarifying our message all along, but it gave us a common vocabulary, common language as an Orange and also as a North Point strategic partner to launch out with, that families were going to be important to us, that we want to partner with parents, that we want to create a church that unchurched people love to attend. And then there was all the urgency of launch, which, as you know, can be crazy. It creates its own momentum. So those are some of the factors leading us to momentum. It was actually momentum that we had as a church that led us to try to do something even greater, we hoped.
Yeah. So Carey, anytime we're talking about a significant change, one of the first steps is helping your team, and in our case, the church, understand the urgency that's required, that will require the change to happen, and that helps to build momentum. So what are some practical steps that you engaged at Connexus to help your team and then the church understand that urgency?
Well, a clear timeline really helped us. We were already meeting as a church, and we had sort of a time where I was going to step back from my denominational commitments at the time, and we didn't want to lose the momentum that we had. So we were off for a few weeks while we went into launch mode, but then we launched fairly quickly, and I think a compressed timeline can really drive urgency. Even when we moved into our new facility in 2015, we said, hey, we need another 100 new volunteers for this new setup at our portable campus and our permanent location. And it's amazing what a deadline does. Like, a lot of people just have dreams, but they have no deadlines. And if you have no deadline for an implementation for change, then that really creates a problem. And I like to make, I'm sort of a launcher. I'm an entrepreneur. I like to turn things around quickly from start to finish. So, if you've got a deadline, and hey, sometimes you need 3-year goals, sometimes you need 2-year goals, but I love a compressed timeline, because deadlines, as Casey Graham says, deadlines drive decisions. And if you are working under a compressed timeline, number one, you feel the urgency as a leader. Number two, your people feel the urgency. Now, you don't want to be stupid about the timeline or irresponsible, but urgency really, really in a compressed timeline can work in your favor, as long as you've got enough time to make it happen. Because if you don't, well, that's a whole other situation. If it lands in a great big fireball, then you could be in trouble for sure. But I know the urgency really helped us, and then clarity was also our friend. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Common language, very, very helpful, particularly in a compressed timeline, because if your vision is fuzzy and you don't really understand it as a team, there's no chance for your people to understand it.
All right. You mentioned vision, and I have found, as I'm sure you have as well, this is key when making changes, because if you just start changing methods, strategies, without connecting it back to the vision, you're going to lose some people along the way. So talk to us a little bit about vision casting. What I have found, and I'm sure this would be your experience as well, is this is something lead pastors, senior pastors, they can't delegate vision casting to somebody else on the team. They have to be the primary vision caster. And it really shifts the way we communicate about vision. So talk to us a little bit, Carey, about how do you do that? How do you step into that role as the primary vision caster, and how do you communicate, again, not only with the congregation, but every step along the way?
Yeah. So where I think vision starts is, it starts in your heart and it starts in your mind. I think that's where it starts as a leader, that you have to be the embodiment of the vision for your organization, because if you don't buy it, nobody else will. That doesn't mean other people can't have input into the vision. I'm not somebody who generally gets broad input on a vision, but I will go to my leadership team. I'll go to, key people, elders, to make sure that the vision is clear, to make sure that the vision represents us, not just me. But it really has to live in you. And I think that gets right down to the language with which you express it. As a communicator, I want to make sure that I'm 100% on board with the vision, because people can tell if you're not. So it needs to start in your heart, start in your mind, start in your prayers, but then it needs to also be communicated in a way that is clear and compelling and understandable by others. Because we've all seen a case where a leader is really excited about something, but he or she is the only person excited. And that's a problem, because you've got to now rally not only people, but their resources behind it. You need to motivate them to give their time, to give their money to a vision. So clarity becomes really important. And I would say, if it's not repeatable, it's not clear. If you haven't summarized it to the point where you're hearing it in the lobby, where the average volunteer or, bought-in church member can repeat it at dinner and understand it at that level, you probably have not got a clear enough vision. The other thing I would say is, a common mistake for a lot of leaders is that we over focus on the what and the how, and we under focus on the why. And I just think the most compelling part of any vision is the why. It's not the what, it's not the how. And as leaders, we live in the what and the how. But like Simon Sinek says, it is the why that really motivates people. And so, going back to when we started Connexus Church, it's just like, hey, you all have friends who have never darkened the door of a church. This is why we're doing this. This is why we're leaving an almost paid for building, and why a lot of us are starting over again. This is why we're going to invite our friends. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And when people see faces, when they connect the dots, it's kind of like, this is January. Some of our, participants today, they're in the gym for the first time in a long time. It's not the what of a gym, okay? It's not the what of a gym, it's the why. I know there are 5 people I know who love working out just for the sake of working out. I do not, but I love the why. I love the results. I love it when I feel better. And so the why will motivate you through a lot of what? Through sacrifice, through early mornings, through, blizzards in our case in north of Toronto. It'll motivate you through an awful lot of what, but you just have to remember the why. And so as a leader, I always try to remind myself, start with why, end with why, pepper the middle with why, and talk a little bit about what and how. Yeah, it's going to be this location. It's going to be X number of dollars. The last thing I'd say about that with vision is that why is unifying, but what and how are divisive? Because there's always multiple opinions on what and how, right? Somebody says, well, why this location? Why not that location? How come it's X dollars, not Y dollars? Well, I don't like that style of music. I prefer this style of music. If you've got a clear and compelling package and you really keep underscoring why, then I think that's very, very different, because people are like, oh, right, this is the kind of music that reaches unchurched people. Oh, right, this is where all the people live. Oh, right, yeah, there are 10 options, but right, we're all in this together. We're trying to reach people. So those are some things that helped us. And we can talk about like how you communicate in concentric circles later if you want.
Yeah, well, in fact, that's where I wanted to go next is okay. as you're talking about change, there are kind of different groups of people that you need to talk with probably different types of information. Wouldn't that be true? So share a little bit about that.
You kind of have, Rick Warren years ago wrote about, I think it was in the Purpose Driven Church, wrote about like circles, and he talked about, 5 C's, the core community or whatever. But how you think of it is just concentric circles. So on the inner circle, which in my case is about 10 people, a few elders, like your elders, we have a small group of elders, and then your key staff, your leadership team, executive team. Those are the people who have input, and probably more even the staff than the elders. But that's where you're like, I'm thinking about this. What about that? So they actually help shape the vision, and they really help create it. I still think as a leader, as a senior leader, it has to have your wordsmithing, your crafting, your heart behind it. Otherwise, it's not going to work particularly well. But that was, I think, where it starts. But then you can get input from other circles. You can go to your wider staff if you have a large staff, or your wider board. Or you can go, in our case, we call them MTRs, and North Point World Ministry Team representatives, 30 of our best volunteers. And consistently over the years, in launch and beyond, when we're changing something, I go to the MTRs. No decision has been made. It's just like, hey guys, this is what we're looking at. This is what we're thinking about and praying about. I'm going to put it up here on the whiteboard. I want you now. Okay, this is the explanation behind it. Ask questions, give us feedback, help us understand, is this a good direction, a bad direction? Like, let us know. And they feel valued. Even though they're not making a decision, they feel really valued and they feel heard. And occasionally they have brilliant ideas and you're like, wow, I'm glad we caught that, because nobody would have thought of that. So that's sort of the input or the dialogue you've got. And then there's a wider circle. This could be key donors. This could be other volunteers. This might be, this is dozens or maybe 100 or 2 people at the most, where you want them to be the first to know. And we've used that a lot. As we've grown, it's like, hey, we just wanted you guys to know this. There's not really any feedback or input, but it's that next circle. So you got your inner core that shapes it. Then you've got people who you get feedback from, input and dialogue. And then you've got this, hey, you should be the first to know. Starting next month or starting in the fall, we're going to do this. And people love that. Occasionally you get feedback, but they're like, whew, thank goodness I didn't hear about that on the announcement. Then you tell your church, and then you tell your community. And that's worked really, really well for us. I mean, starting from congregational meetings 22 years ago when there were like 5 people, that's pretty easy to have a congregational meeting. But as it scaled, that's been really helpful and really healthy for us.
Yeah. So can we go off the script for a second, Carey?
Of course.
Because I want to ask you, when you look back in your journey in leadership, what was the biggest learning lesson or the biggest challenge you found as you've tried to build momentum around a new vision?
When it comes to input, what's coming to mind is listen. Early on, I felt very defensive of the vision. You almost feel like someone's criticizing your baby or telling you your baby is ugly. And, I would get my back up. And fortunately, in my public days, when we were in meetings where people were opposed to the vision, I learned pretty early on just to shut up and to listen, even if I was dying inside. A couple of things. Number one, most people just want to be heard, and you're going to move ahead anyway. Number two, sometimes you get really good ideas and you just miss stuff as a leader, and you really need to have your ears open. And number three, most of that stuff goes away anyway and doesn't ruin the day. I mean, often opponents are loud, but just because they're loud doesn't mean it's large. It's usually not a very large number. They're just a loud number. So those are some things I've really learned about it. And then the second learning would be, I just never, ever get sick of it. You will get sick of it. You feel like you've said this 1,000 times. And if you're a leader who's future oriented, and future is one of my strengths on Strength Finders, you're already done with it. By the time it's launched, you're sick of it and you're ready to move on to what's next. And no, this has to be it's like writing a book. When I started writing books a few years ago, that's a pretty, as you know, Tony, a pretty intimidating process. And you're like, when you get your 5 key chapters or your 7 key chapters, you get your key ideas. I remember thinking before the final draft is done, I'm going to have to live with these ideas for 5 or 10 years. Like, do I like the way they're phrased? I'm giving talks in a few weeks on a book I wrote 7 years ago. It's a good thing I still like it, because I'm like, oh boy, doing that again, right? But like those words and a vision and a mission and a strategy, they're going to live on for a long time. And so you just have to be okay. It's like being in a rock band, right? Like, I'm sure you two, they're doing their 30th anniversary Joshua Tree thing. They probably sung Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For enough to sing it again. But they're going to have to play that until they die. If they're going to play in front of fans, because if they come with their B-side and all new material, everybody wants their money back. So as a leader, you're in that place where you're just saying the same things over and over and over and over again. So make sure you like what you're going to say.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my problem is some of my books are 10 years old too, and I don't know if I agree with half of what's in those books anymore.
That does happen, doesn't it?
All right, so we've now started to establish and cast vision, and we're building momentum around the vision. The next step we need to be concerned with, though, as we're leading change, is reorganizing our leadership structure. And this, of course, is making sure we get the right people in the right roles. And to kind of lead us through this conversation, I've invited Paul to step in here. And the reason why is Paul, in his role as executive pastor at Sun Valley out in the Phoenix area. Yeah, Paul, you've been through a number of structural changes throughout the years. In fact, when I think of you and your ministry, it kind of reminds me, recently I read a book under new management. I think David Burkus is the name of the author. And one of the things he talked about is your org structure should be written down in pencil. And I think you've made a practice of that at Sun Valley. But I'm curious, as we kind of step into the conversation, what are some key components of a healthy leadership structure within a church?
Yeah, Tony, you're right. It does need to be written in pencil, because chances are it's going to change. And if you're in a growing organization, it's going to change quickly. I've been here 6 years, had the same title the entire time. Every 6 to 8 months, I feel like my job's changed because the organization needs something different from me. And I'm glad we started with vision, because structure needs to serve vision, not the other way around. The goal is not structure. The goal is the vision. And so I think people have got to get used to structural changes as the norm. If you think about this in the real everyday life, the way your life is structured as a single person, that changes when you get married. And then when you have a child, it changes again. And in my case, you go to 4 kids and everything changes. And so to think that organizations would work differently than the way real life is designed to work is probably naive. So to think that the way your church is structured today is the way your church needs to be structured tomorrow, that's fine if you like the results you're getting today and you want to stay where you are. But if you want to be forward-minded, reach more people with the gospel, your structure is going to need to change. And there are some key things to keep in mind. I remember reading an article on Harvard Business Review. They were doing an interview with C-suite employees around the country at Fortune 500 companies. And through interview and study, they discovered even high capacity Fortune 500 C-suite leaders have 5 to 10 direct reports. And once it gets past 5 to 10 direct reports, things start getting a little wonky. The wheels start to fall off. We're talking highly competent people who have been doing this for a long amount of time. And so span of care is one of the things you want to look at when you want to talk about your structure and the way you're going to staff. Lines of communication is another one you want to look at. When communication stops cascading quickly through the organization, you probably have a structure issue. When implementation begins to slow down, when there's a low level of accountability to results. I'm just kind of rattling off some bullet lists here for you. But these are things when organizations start feeling these kind of pressure points, those are indicators our structure probably needs to change. And to keep in mind, the other side of it is it doesn't matter how beautiful your structure is, how nice and neat and clean it looks on paper. If you don't have the right people, the structure is not going to work. And so, think about the New England Patriots getting ready to play in Super Bowl number whatever now for them. Belichick's got a fantastic system, but you understand he's making mid-year trades on his team to constantly get the right people in his system to make it work. So it's not one or the other, it's both.
You just mentioned the Patriots, and I kind of lost you for a second. Sorry. It's they're kind of like the Yankees in my book, Paul. It's just I don't want to see them win anymore. But hey, it is what it is. That's right.
It is what it is.
All right. So talk to us a little bit about the key structural shifts that you and your team have had to make through the years to accommodate the growth and the change that you're seeing in your ministry.
Well, yeah, there's two things I think that prompt structural change. One is a proactive approach and one is a reactive approach. Proactively, you can have a strong clarity around a vision like what Carey was talking about. And then you ask the question, how are we going to get there? And then the structure of the organization begins to fall in line to serve the vision. The other way is reactive. In other words, the organization's experiencing pain. And pain is a gift from God. It tells you something's wrong and something needs to change. I have little kids and kids learn through pain. I'm an adult, 20 years of marriage, I still learn through pain. It tells me something's wrong and needs to change. And so you can go proactive, you can go reactive, and we've gone both ways. And chances are our participants have experienced change both ways as well. And so a couple of things I think you need to take a look at. I'll just give you some examples that we've had to deal with that I think are common to church world. Like a lot of churches 6 years ago, we had a groups system, we had a outreach system, we had a care system, and you kind of go on down the line. And we had a lot of people who were clamoring for airtime on the weekend services, attention, resources, dollars, and so on, volunteers, and so on. And we changed that. Instead of having competing systems, we squished all of our groups, local outreach, care, next steps stuff all together into one system. And so that helped us restructure how we took people from, I've just met Jesus, what do I do next, to I'm actually following Jesus and I can feed myself spiritually and I can engage and use my gifts to serve the church and serve the community. I think the key issue there is how do you get all of the energy of the organization going in the same direction? How do you get all the horses pulling the same direction? And I think a lot of times our structures, because we're clinging to something we've had for a long time, we can create organizational drift or we can create competition. As a result, the vision slows down. So some things we've had to deal with, we've had to expand our executive team. We've gone to multiple executives on our team. We've had to expand our central service team, the team that serves all 5 of our campuses. We've had to change our campus pastor team. There was a point in time, Tony, where all the campus pastors reported to me. And I actually liked that time because I loved those men and I loved that team, and they were fun, and they represented and carried the culture of Sun Valley everywhere in their context. But there came a point in time where I couldn't help Sun Valley move where Sun Valley needed to go and still lead that team. I had to let go of the team. And so sometimes organizational shift is hard because it's not what you want to do, but it's what's best for the church. And I've got to get over what I got to do and say the church doesn't serve me, I serve the church. And so I've got to let go of personal preference to get to the vision.
Yeah, let me circle back to, because on these first two questions, you mentioned kind of span of care and then specifically how your team has had to shift through the years. And you acknowledged that the high capacity C-suite folks that Harvard Business Review identified 5 to 10 in the span of care. What we have to remember is that's business world. And in church world, particularly for senior pastors, they only get to lead with half their time because the other half their time they're working on study, message prep, message delivery. And so I think it's, Paul, tell me if you would think otherwise, but for someone in that type of role to have a span of care, I think even beyond 4 or 5 is really asking a lot of somebody.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you, Tony. Personally, I used to teach about 25% of the time at Sun Valley. I was on the teaching team, but it got to the point where the organizational leadership that was needed to move the ball forward here, every moment I was preparing to teach was a moment I wasn't coaching or leading. And so it's really hard to do both. And so that senior pastor is leading a church of 200, 100, 500, to expect him to be fantastic as an organizational leader, and leading structurally and leading through change, as well as being a fantastic communicator, boy, it's a tough thing to put a foot in both of those roles and do both of them well. And so reducing your number of direct reports can help alleviate that.
Certainly can. All right. So today we're talking about leading change. And the first thing we probably need to remember is this, that any change, regardless of the scope and scale of the change, is going to impact someone. And that's going to happen more directly, though, when we're talking about leading structural change. So, Paul, help us understand, how do we walk through these types of changes when we're adjusting staffing and structure?
Yeah. Well, I think if you go back to what Carey said about communicating vision, communicating change, whether it's vision and getting buy-in to that and getting that cultural language landed, and embraced, or structural change. I think the same principles are at play. Who does the change affect? Are you having the senior leadership team kick this around to make sure that you kind of tear it apart, strengthen the ideas, shoot any holes in it, and make it better before you execute it? Timelines are really important. To be able to say, oh, I feel like we need to change this. How many churches have that conversation about we need to change the structure, and a year later they're still talking about we still need to change the structure? Timelines and deadlines, and then build your plan and work your plan. So cascading communication is important, and thinking concentric circles that Carey gave us the model at the front end of this conversation, I think it's a fantastic model to go with. Thinking about who does this structural change impact, and then talk to them on the front end of it. Don't surprise people. No one likes to be surprised. And so if you can have that conversation early and often, get their buy-in, and let them be a champion of it as well, because there's no such thing as, the executive pastor said we need to make these changes, and so we're making these changes. That's not leadership. That kind of person is not going to last on your team very long. There's no such thing as they and we. It's just us, and we're all on the team together. So I think those concentric circles are a great model that Carey gave us.
That's good. All right, good stuff, Paul. All right, so we are building momentum around a big new vision. We're getting the right structure in place to carry out this change. But then in church world, you have to begin to look at ministry, and primarily that should revolve, I think, around the discipleship path. For the last year or so, we've been talking quite a bit about shifting from programs to path. And Gabe at Westside out in the Portland area, he's been down that journey. In fact, Gabe, this might not surprise you, but nearly 70% of the pastors told us they were looking to simplify their discipleship pathway. And you've done that, haven't you? You've walked through that journey at Westside. Can you talk to us a little bit about the turnaround that you've made at Westside on this topic?
Yeah, we had a long history. Our church has been around since the '60s, so there was plenty of things that have kind of hung on over the decades of ministry. And it's funny how people attach sort of eternal value to temporary things, isn't it? And then they start holding on really tight. And so we had plenty of those kinds of things we were dealing with. I mean, our church had pews and hymns and had lots of stuff back in the day, and those things get to be really, really sacred to people. So one of the things I think that for our case is, we had gone through the process of looking at vision change, and as we mentioned, that that's the first place, and then we'd looked at the structure piece, and then we'd said, I think now, how do you drive that new way into the organization? For us, I think it was just that honest evaluation to start with, that just to be honest, let's look at it objectively, maybe by the numbers, maybe let's evaluate honestly about, is that midweek service with 23 people really going to turn the city upside down? Because it might be good and it might be fun for some people and it might be meaningful for a few people, but if we're committed to those things that have to do with the old structure, the old vision, then we're never gonna get to a new place. So we had to just really take a hard look at all of the things, and just really, I think one of the phrases we heard a long time ago was, prior doesn't mean priority. And that was a really freeing way to go, prior doesn't mean priority, that whatever God has put on our heart for this season of his ministry and his community is that needs to be the priority. So that honest evaluation, we had to clarify a few things. That was for us really, really important, and we needed a grid to do that. And one of the things that we probably didn't have this language when we were going through it, but I think it surfaced as we realized what we had been doing, is we were looking for an intersection of a few things. We were looking for an intersection of what is God's heart for our area. What is he speaking? What's he doing? We also looked at what are the needs in the community. So where do those things overlap? God has a heart for things. What are the needs? And then we looked at the third one was, what are the strengths of the church? Because every church is unique, and we had to look at, if we're headed there, and if this is who we are, and if this is who the community is, then there's a few things that we probably need to look at that need to replace old things and all that. So we had to contextualize this idea that we're making disciples in a place. So for us, that meant getting rid of some of the things that people had hung on to, like midweek service, and in some cases, eliminating lots of stuff. Eliminating adult Sunday school was one of the things we did. That was a tough thing. People didn't like that. We had eliminated a Sunday night, service that was a little more of a deeper focus, and that was a tough turn. But we had to replace that with multiple services on Sunday mornings and with a strong way to get people connected in community, and then get people on mission. And so for us, probably that elimination piece was really, it was not fast. For us, and we had to take time on some of those things. I'm a kind of person that also likes things fairly quickly, and so for me, I'm thinking, man, 6 weeks, let's cut this adult Sunday school thing. Let's just make an announcement and let's just do this. But we had to obviously drip it, and then I think a key for us was to offer replacements for things. When you're taking somebody's ministry program away, if we can have a replacement, that was helpful for us to have a new way. It's kind of going back up to that why. Getting people back, zooming out to, it's not about, we're not committed to a program. We're not committed to a method. We're committed to a mission. We're committed to a vision. And so if this is a better way to accomplish that vision, so then some new things started to bubble up in our case, but it was much simpler. It went from, 10 things to 3 things, or 10 things to 2 things. And one of the things that happened there was we probably had to eliminate some of the things that we were doing just to free up some of the bandwidth, so that the staff and the team had the time to think about where we headed. So there was honestly a little lull where there was quite a bit of discontent in our church because people were, we needed some space. And so there was that little bit of season of discontent, but we went through those pains, and thankfully, I feel like now there's a much more clear pathway for what God has called us to do.
So Gabe, talk us through then, as you were trying to simplify the pathway at Westside, what difference did it make? Give us kind of that big overview of your church was here, you simplified the pathway. What impact did that have for you?
I think short answer is more volunteers and stronger leaders. which, for us has been a little bit of a surprising, like, wow, that was interesting how that happened. But if you think about, we've got people not busy in 100 directions, but they're moving towards something meaningful. That's been definitely one of the outcomes. And another piece is that when we had so many things going on that were honestly a little bit insider focused, one of the things that happened is people would come in the door and the threshold was a little bit high. So they needed to step over some things and all of that to figure out, how do I get involved in this church? Do I have to be involved in Sunday night? Do I have to be involved in Wednesday night? Do I have to do all this stuff? Or, what is following Jesus all about? So when we eliminated some of the clutter, it lowered the threshold, but also by providing a clear pathway that had a more challenging outcome for people, it attracted and kept people who probably would have left our church out of boredom or frustration. And so it not only lowered the threshold, but it raised the ceiling. And so now that, for instance, now we have a residency program, and we've got people who are going, hey, I think God's calling me to ministry. I want to be a campus pastor. And it's fun because we actually know what to do with these people at this point, because we're not busy doing so many things that aren't actually making a difference. So I'd say that was one of the things that has happened in our case. Maybe another thing for the average person in our church is that they just have a little bit better sense that there's always a challenging next step for everyone. There's always a challenging next step for me, and a compelling next step. So that's been something that has been really, really helpful.
I want to go back to Carey here in a moment, but Gabe, in addition to the discipleship pathway, your church made a significant change in recent years. In fact, not many churches would be willing to do this. You walked away from a building that you owned and went back to portable space. Talk a little bit about leading your church through that change, because that's significant.
Yeah, that was significant. And it was, for us, we were just in a situation where our building was no longer serving, at that point in time, the mission, the vision. And so it was actually a hindrance rather than a help. And so we mustered the troops. There was a bit of urgency in it, and I can connect with Carey's mentality on that. There was some urgency that we needed to make some changes. We were out of space, but we tried to paint the picture of what would happen if we didn't make the sacrifice to do the thing that needed to be done in order to reach the vision. And we all came to the same conclusion that we're not willing to walk away from the people that God's going to bring to our church just because it's more comfortable to be in a certain space. So that was really good. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what you do, not everybody's coming. And we had to just own up to that. Not everybody's coming. Not everybody likes the idea of going portable. Not everybody likes the idea of being in a building. And so, I think in those times we have to be a little bit open-handed with realizing this is God's church. And he may be, honestly, he may be moving some of his people around on purpose, and that's okay. That's all right. Right. We don't own these people. So
that's right. That's good. All right. So Carey, you also, while you were at Connexus way back when, really had to work through simplifying the discipleship pathway. Now, my question is, once you've done that, there are going to be other new good ideas that come along the way. How do you evaluate the new opportunities that come to you after you've gone through a simplification process to focus your discipleship pathway?
Yeah, I think the primary thing for us, Tony, has been to be crystal clear on our strategy. And where I find a lot of churches lose focus and clarity, and I mean, I've been guilty of this too at times, is very clear mission, very clear vision. But our mission and vision often mean exactly the same thing from church to church, right? All of our mission statements, vision statements have something to do with God, Jesus, reaching people. Like they should, otherwise you're not a church, right? But the real delineator is not the mission or vision, it's the strategy. And so to have clarity of strategy, I think is a gift, but it's also very divisive, because as Gabe was just saying, when your strategy is we're leaving a paid for building and we're moving that we own into portable church, a journey I've also made. Not everybody thinks that's a great idea. Like people think that's a terrible idea, and a lot of people leave. And so that again is a strategic call. Just like staying in the building is another form of strategy, maybe not as wise a strategy if you want to reach people, but that gets very, very divisive. And so we've been hyper-focused on our strategy, which once you decide on it, and you have clarity around it, and you've got alignment around it, makes decision making very easy. So probably the last really big push, I'll walk you through a practical thing, came just under 2 years ago when we moved into our new building in the spring of 2015. And so after having been a double portable church for 7-8 years, we had a lot of people, mostly church people, not unchurched people, who were with us say, so now that we have a building, we're going to be open like 5-6 nights a week, right? And we're like, no. And they're like, well, why are we building a building? Well, it's a broadcast location. It's a headquarters for our staff. You know, we think it's going to help us launch out on student retreats. And it's like, well, can't we offer the Bible study on Tuesday night in the X group? And like, we hadn't done that for years, but people had assumed that it was only because we couldn't, not because we wouldn't. We just decided we weren't going to. So long story short, that's where we ended up on that. And I think having a very clear strategy, and you want to revisit that every 2 to 5 years. I don't think you need to, you know, every time somebody says, I want to go off strategy or in a new direction, I don't think you have to call the senior leadership team and the elders together and like, oh, we got to rethink all this. But every 2 or 3 years, you should have the ability to rethink, reconsider. And then obviously, if you're hearing something over and over and over and over again, or there's a need, we have become a little more diverse, but we realize we have a lot of young attenders, but they're not always feeling competent to step into leadership. So we developed this thing called Lead You. It is technically not a step. It's technically something in addition to our strategy, but we did it very deliberately. We did it on purpose, and we did it for a specific period of time to raise up a group of leaders. We're going to do it again this year. But I think if you're moving off strategy, you should at least have a reason. The default should be to stay on, but then be very, very intentional if you're going to add something to the mix.
Good stuff. All right. So we're in a moment going to shift to some live Q&A, which is always fun. Before we get there, in fact, if you're still wanting to submit questions, feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Before we get there, I want to talk about 3 next steps that you can take. First one, and it's first because you all should do this. I have Carey's book, Lasting Impact, in my hands here. In fact, Carey, I think you actually autographed this one for me.
Well, of course, for you too.
Yes, you did. I love that. Thank you.
So you're going to give that one away, right?
Well, no, I'm not going to give this one away. But Carey, talk to us about some next steps folks can take around lasting impact.
Yeah, actually, it's 7 conversations that we've had around the Connexus leadership table, and as I've talked to church leaders, both in person on my blog, via my podcast, that keep surfacing. Like, why are people attending church less often? What's changing in the culture, and what do we need to respond to? How do you lead change in your church? Is our church really healthy? They seem to be some of the top 7 issues that keep surfacing. Mm-hmm. So what I did with that book was I kind of framed the issue, and then create small group questions after each chapter so you can walk through it with your board. And then on my website, leadlikeneverbefore.com, there's actually a video companion series I developed last year for it as well, if you want to take your board through it. It's just the Lasting Impact Team Edition. So it's designed for study to help you rethink really how you do ministry and why you do ministry. So that's sort of the idea behind the book.
Very good. The other thing, the second step we want to encourage you to take, in fact, we'll include this in the follow-up email you'll be receiving. We want you to take a look at the communications planning guide. This is a tool that our team actually uses with the churches that we serve as we're helping them walk through new vision, new strategy, and then implementing and communicating change. And rather than just hold this for our benefit, we're going to give it to you for free. So you can use this with your team as you're beginning to think about key changes that you need to make in your ministry. I think you'll find that this guide gives you some practical next steps that you should consider. And then the third step that I'd like you to consider is our Unstuck group process. We have a 4-phase process to help churches assess the health of their church, plan for the future, taking a look at your vision and your strategy, structure for the future. We're obviously hitting a couple of key things we talked about today. And then the 4th phase is about putting all of that into action. So assess, plan, structure, and then put it into action, all 4 of those steps. We'd love to help you with that. And you can learn more about that 4-phase process at theunstuckgroup.com. So let me pull up the questions here. Mark has been working diligently in the background on these. Here's the first one. Let's see. I'm going to read it, and then we'll decide who can best answer it. What are some of the best ways to create urgency in a church that tends to respond slowly, and how much? Well, let's start there. Carey, since you hit the vision, I'm going to let you talk about that. And I think, as I remember back, even the early part of your journey at Connexus Church, it was a very traditional church before you took over.
Pre-Connexus, when it was at the 3 Presbyterian churches, it was highly traditional and nobody was moving quickly. 2 things to think about. We already talked about the why behind the what. The why is going to move people way more than what or how. But the other thing would be, what is your personal passion level? And I was reading a book by Stephen Pressfield, which I think I left on an airplane, which is too bad. I'll have to get another copy, called Do the Work. And he was saying something that was really quite neat, that most creatives and artists and people who sort of create things, like even writers or preachers, one of the things that works for you is you don't know any better not to, I'm not saying this well, you don't know any better not to do the work. In other words, when I was 30 something and starting out in leadership, I was just passionate about reaching unchurched people. I didn't know a hundredth of what I know now. And sometimes knowledge is your enemy, not your friend. And you got to keep your passion burning bright. You've got to be naively optimistic that this is going to work. I mean, that's what entrepreneurs, that's what leaders do. And you just have to believe it. And if you really believe it, and I still believe it, I mean, I absolutely believe it. But when I think of myself back then, I was just a kid out of law school who ended up in seminary out of what I perceived to be a calling, who didn't know what he was doing. And I just kind of said to the church, I don't think you guys know what you're doing, no offense, but I sure don't know what I'm doing, so let's try to figure it out together. And we just went out there and we reached people. And I mean, that passion, like I think one of the shadow sides of our hyper-connected world that we live in, and I'm definitely part of the problem, and because you're always publishing stuff, is we know so much now. And sometimes that can work for us and sometimes that can work against us. And don't let your knowledge, don't let the odds dampen your enthusiasm. Be passionate, be on your knees, be praying, keep your motives pure, and just go out there and do it. And, one of my favorite quotes, John Wesley, light yourself on fire with passion and people will come from miles to watch you burn. There's truth to that. And if you God lights a big fire inside you, it's going to catch. Might run some people out of the building. But hey, it's going to catch. So that's what I would say. Really look at your personal passion level.
Okay, Paul, this one's for you. How can you reduce the span of care that is too dependent on the pastor to lead the change?
That's mine, huh? Thanks.
Because we love you, Paul.
Yeah, I feel the love. Hey, honestly, you can get yourself into trouble. I can remember having a conversation with my dad. He was the executive director of a naval submarine base. And I was feeling pressure as a young man in ministry because I felt like every decision was coming through me. My work was never done. People's lives were never fixed. There was never an end to the ministry. And I remember having a conversation with him, complaining to him about my time and my schedule. And you don't understand, Dad. And my dad is on the phone. And in the way only a father can, he says, son, I'm responsible for billions of dollars of government assets and thousands of employees. Did I ever miss a soccer game that you had growing up? Did I ever miss going to dinner with the family in the evening? And of course I said no. And he kind of shocked me into sober-mindedness. And the conversation that ensued is, I'm responsible for me. I'm responsible for my schedule. I'm responsible for my behaviors. I'm responsible for my actions. And my behaviors, actions, the way I spend my time actually train others around me how to behave as well. Mm-hmm. And so as a lead pastor or as a senior leader of an organization, if you find every person is coming to you, it may be, in fact, if you get real sober-minded about it, it probably is because you've trained them to come to you. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to figure out how to say no. No is a complete sentence. You can actually train people to go to other people. It's okay to look at someone and say, to listen to what they're saying, and then the response can be, that's not my problem. Because it really probably isn't your problem. There's a reason why you have them on the team. Let them do their job. Don't do their job for them. And so I would encourage you, it's okay not to do everybody's job for them. It's okay not to train everybody that come to you. Now, practically speaking, Who are you going to be? Your direct reports going to be? If you're the senior leader, real quick, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you in their area of expertise. Surround yourself with people who think about the whole church, not just their segment of the church. So if they're going to be on a senior leadership team with you and they're going to be making decisions about the church, they don't need to just be thinking about the youth ministry. They don't need to just be thinking about the worship servers. They need to think about the whole thing. And so when you start talking about who's going to report to you, another one is, are they culture carriers? Do they reflect your values? Are they going to make decisions the way you make decisions? Are they going to embrace your language and your ethos and represent that to the rest of the team? And then finally, do you like them? It's hard for me to work with people I don't like. And don't, that may seem real shallow, but it actually may be the easiest step to start taking. When you look at your team and who's coming to you for answers, who do you like? The way they think, the way they behave, the way they execute, the way they implement, the way they carry themselves. So when you're starting to think about, how do I get from 15 people coming to me and I've got to give them all the answers to 3 or 4 or 5 people coming to me and we're serving and working together. Those are some tips that might help you along the way.
That's good, Paul. All right, Gabe, this one's for you. You ready?
Oh boy.
It's about the pace of change. How do you know? Okay. How do you know when the pace of change is appropriate, or if you're going too fast or too slow?
Yeah, I think our main indicator when we were going too fast was when there was no more people or money. Just kidding. But you kind of see the stress points, I think, in people. And if there's a lot of conflict, I suppose if you're looking at it going like, I don't know that we're going to make it. It's probably not because everybody else is wrong, and it's probably not because they don't get it. It's probably because we're not leading well, and it might be time to slow down and ask some good questions. And I think, for me, the important thing isn't as much the pace of change as it is their unity, is their vision alignment. Because, I don't want to force people to do anything. As a matter of fact, I think that we ought to be leading people places not for the sake of the organization. A vision should serve the world, not the church. Vision should serve the people in the church, not the organization of the church. So if those people aren't understanding the connection between what we're doing and how it empowers them to be Christ followers in the world and be on mission, then we got to slow down, because otherwise there's no point in continuing if that's not happening. We might have a goal or a target, but if it doesn't lead us to people empowered on mission, it's not the right pace. That might be the indicator too, is, if there's all that conflict and we're not getting there. I think in general, we try to go a little too fast at this stuff. And to be honest with you, in my case, I was very impatient. I was taking over ministry from my father-in-law, which is another complication, but actually a blessing in our case. And I just had this thing in my mind about how things were going to go. And I remember in one day in the office, actually we were in the kitchen of the church, and he pulls me aside and he said, your biggest problem is that you're going to need to slow down a little bit. And those were hard words for me to hear, because I was like, yeah, but we got all this stuff to do. And I didn't realize at the time that slower was actually faster, because it enabled people to really understand where we were headed, to really be a part of it. And now, I would look back and go, yeah, I'm glad that we didn't hurry too much on those things. So for me, the stress point is probably the disconnect on, are people feeling like this is valuable?
So Gabe, here's my perspective. I think for those of us on this call, this panel today, that is our tendency. Our tendency is to go too fast. However, I would say generally in the church, I think the tendency is to go too slow with change. And the danger with that, when you go too slow, is you create more opportunity for people who are against the change to rally behind that position to keep things the way they are. And so if you don't go fast enough, it creates more of an opportunity for churches to stay stuck. And Carey, I think you were actually alluding to that earlier.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I agree that some of us need to have brakes put on, but most church leaders I know need the gas pedal more than the brakes. And what I would say is, you're going to lose people. When it comes to leading change, you're going to lose somebody, but you have to choose who you're going to lose. because if you are too fast, you may lose some opponents. You may lose a couple of good people along the way. Unfortunately, you don't want to do that. But if you're too slow, you will lose all your early adopters and your innovators. And those are the people who are going to go to somewhere who will lead them. They're going to go to a church that is making progress. They're going to go to a church that isn't stalling, isn't stuck, and isn't making excuses. They're going to go to find a leader who will lead them. And so the question is, who do you want to lose? Do you want to lose the grumpy, angry people who probably need to go and not give and not serve somewhere else? Or do you want to lose the people who are probably going to help you build the future? And so I want to be more afraid of losing the early adopters than I do about losing the opponents.
Okay, I have another good question to come back to for Carey, and I think Paul can speak into it. But Gabe, talk a little. Give us an example of what a clear discipleship path looks like.
Thank you for the question. I think one of the things it has to begin with somebody who isn't here yet. And I think that's really important, is we can't assume that we're going to begin the discipleship process. We really ask the question, when did Jesus start discipleship? It was when he said, follow me, right? And he went up to these total strangers. And so I think our pathway has to begin with people who aren't here yet. And we should assume, no spiritual experience, no church experience. And so if we figure out how to position ourselves to have relationship and connection and valuable next steps for everybody, including all the way down to that level, then that's good. I think if we have it too complicated, that if there's 6 or 7 or 10 steps, that's really hard to remember. I'm a big fan of some of the work that was done with the Reveal study, just because it's so helpful to have that wide of a swath. So you're dealing with that many people that have indicated what was helpful in moving them. So for us, it's been somewhat that it's the environments, maybe not the programs, that help people move in some ways. And then also if there can just be some clear moves. And so for us, there's 4 phases we've identified. There's 3 moves, there's 3 steps. And then what we've tried to do is to say, like if somebody's exploring faith, how do you then offer things that help people who are exploring faith? Like, could we have small groups that reach out to people who are exploring faith? Because, if we don't, then what are we really saying to those folks? So, and then, maybe some first steps, and then maybe some little bit deeper stuff. And at some point I think it also has to lead to multiplication. It has to lead people to a place where they can see themselves on mission, really chasing God's dream for their life. And, in our case, that's been helpful because, as I said, we've lowered the threshold, raised the ceiling. And so now we've got people who are sticking with us who are saying, hey, I think you can help me go into even vocational ministry as a next step. And, whereas before, I don't think we wouldn't have had that line of sight for people to say, man, I really know where I'm headed as a believer. So I think it's just got to be clear, simple, and kind of comprehensive.
That's good. All right. Last question. And Carey and Paul, we have about a minute and a half to respond. So we'll see how you do with this. Talk to us a little bit about the situation where the primary teacher is not the primary leader. In fact, that primary teacher might have the senior pastor title, but they're not a gifted leader. And how might a church then position themselves to lead through the types of changes that we're talking about? Carey, I want to go to you first, because though you are a very gifted leader, in some respects, you've already made the shift. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, 18 months ago, I stepped out of the lead pastor role into the founding teaching pastor role, and Jeff Brody, whom we both know, is the new lead pastor. Part of that is just a further refinement of what I believe to be God's calling on my life. Also, the stage of our church, having turned 50, I wanted to make sure a younger leader was leading, et cetera, et cetera. So there were reasons there, but I think that leader communicator role, I think the challenge, honestly, in 20 seconds or less, is that sometimes the senior pastor is neither a gifted communicator nor a gifted leader. That is a problem. That is a big problem. And you need to be gifted in at least one of those areas. So I would say if you have somebody who's a gifted communicator but not a gifted leader, that's great. Become a gifted communicator, find a gifted leader. If you have somebody who's a gifted leader, not a gifted communicator, that's great. Find a gifted communicator if you have the budget and the bandwidth for that. I think the biggest challenge churches get into is when the senior pastor is neither, which means you probably need both. But you can separate the roles effectively. It's been done numerous times. Paul?
Yeah.
I'd completely agree with you, Carey. I think it comes down to sober-mindedness, humility, and submission. Are you sober-minded about which one you are or you aren't? Are you willing to submit to the other person in their area of brilliance? And do you have the humility to live with that tension? And if you care more about the vision than you do about your ego, you care more about serving the church than the church serving you, you can make this work. But it does take all of that.
All right, very good. Hey, thanks again for joining us today. I want to first thank my panel again, Carey, Gabe, Paul. Really appreciate you. Mark, Tiffany, working behind the scenes. We appreciate you as well. Those next 3 steps we talked about, pick up Carey's book, Lasting Impact. Also, secondly, look for the communications planning guide. It'll be in your inbox. And third of all, we want to help you walk through change. The Unstuck Group is prepared to do that, and you can learn more about that process at theunstuckgroup.com. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you sometime in the future.